Hello everyone, my name is Steven with a V and welcome to Storytime. Today we're going to be reading some malicious compliance stories, tales where following the rules can lead to some just desserts. And let me just say, if you're not already subscribed to Storytime, please consider doing so. But with that being said, let's sit back, relax, and listen to some captivating Reddit stories. Push untested concepts to production? Okay. About 9 years ago, I used to work as a system admin for a company that had about 30 developers scattered between in-house, locals, and outsourcers. There were a dozen project managers, only 2 of whom were actually doing any useful work, and the CDO, Chief of Development Operations. The CDO was an otherwise respectable guy being torn between the board of directors, the CTO, and the various project managers. He was stretched thin, and towards the end of his employment, less and less in the office. Because of this, a few project managers were running rampant, including one we'll call the Brain. The Brain was a self-congratulatory developer who was intelligent and knew a lot about coding, but he was really terrible about process and had a short temper. This made him a terrible project manager. He was also a jacked up, new age bro hunk with all kinds of Sanskrit or Hindi tattoos and photos of him on top of mountains and doing endurance challenges. In lunch meetings, he'd usually comment on your diet choices. You putting that in your body? You know all the nutrition in that is wasted in the small intestine. Bad fuel, no fuel biscuit. You get the type. One of his most annoying bits was he always wanted to use bleeding edge, not ready for primetime tools and procedures. If there was a paper on the topic, he was on it like a bloodhound. Enter Docker. For those who don't know IT, Docker is a way to make little micro operating systems that work right off the host system's kernel. They call them containers, and they differ from virtual machines in the fact they make a little microcosm that has just enough libraries and packages to run your application and nothing more. They have been around for about a decade, and before that they were called chroot jails, and more theory used for small applications in the production arena, such as file transfer protocol services. Docker was a way to automate all of this. But at the time of this story, Docker was in some kind of weird alpha state, where there were new builds every week fixing the bugs of last week and adding new bugs to be fixed the next week. It still ran on LXC, the chroot jail for Ubuntu. This would be my introduction to it. Before, we had been using VirtualBox and Vagrant, which was also fairly new. We had enormous Vagrant files in Git repositories, and you download them, build virtual machines, and do your work on those. But that system was not perfect, mostly because instead of having development pushed to testing and then pushed to production if it passed or back to development if it didn't, it was edited in testing until it did work, then pushed to production. So development was never reflective of the actual production environment and not updated with fixes. So often you'd re-freak something you unfreaked last week. What made it even more confusing was there were dozens of development environments depending on which developers, in-house, locals, or outsourcers were using it. We'd have 4 to 5 times as many development servers for each production server, and they often conflicted with one another. In some cases, very unsafe practices were involved. We had a shopping cart application, for instance, with a world writable cache that, if you figured this out, could hand edit your cart and change the price of everything to $0 and check out with as many products as you wanted for free. Luckily, we had a niche customer base who were not tech savvy, but we had a lot of security through obscurity going on. At one point, the Brain said that we were using Docker from now on, just out of the blue. We barely had Docker running in development, but the Brain said, "This is the future." And while he was ultimately right, at this time, it was unstable and buggy as heck. After weeks of painful development made worse by the fact our outsourcers were complete idiots with a bucket of crabs mentality, one of the things they did was purposefully obfuscate their code into human unreadable but machine readable gibberish. So they had hundreds of PHP scripts that looked like solid blocks of random text where no one knew what they did or what they meant, making troubleshooting near impossible to the other coders. So when they failed in testing, send it back to the outsourcers. This was their intent in job security, I am gathering. Anyway, so we had this vital application used by over 100,000 users which, while not perfect, at least looked on the surface fairly stable. It only crashed a few times a day, and there were scripts that could detect this and get things running again before anyone noticed. Downtime was reduced to less than a minute, which you could blame on the network or heavy volume. In development, Docker was very unstable, and despite the fact Docker had its own restart upon fail settings, it couldn't detect all the fail states of the buggy application. Our own scripts were not Docker savvy, and the kludge fix of the original kludge was not working. After months of lingering in horrible, mutated states, kill me. The brain got so agitated we weren't getting anywhere, he channeled his inner Bill O'Reilly.
Freak it, we'll do it live!
But it's failed tests A, B, and C. We haven't even started testing X, Y, and Z.
Push it to production.
We haven't even done volume and traffic tests.
We'll do it live.
His theory was, as he explained in the post-disaster analysis, to
sink or swim
the entire development team, who, in his opinion, were just dawdling crybabies too scared to do anything but whine about having to do actual work that they were hired for. As the lone Linux admin, I voiced my objections several times, which the brain just laughed at.
This is the real world, kiddo.
I got it all in writing, with my boss CC'd. This fueled the brain's crybaby accusation because I didn't do anything without Daddy Boss Man's approval. My boss, the CTO, didn't like the brain very much, but a lot of the board of directors did, so he kept quiet and gave him as much rope as he asked for. The only objection he had was, I hope you have a backup plan. I did. I actually spent the night before making backups and restore scenarios, because I was positive that this was going to be an unmitigated disaster. But I had never done this kind of restore in production and scripted as much as I could ahead of time, taking the changes into consideration. Production was complicated because of the networking environment that production was cocooned in. The only way in or out was tightly restricted by Cisco's ICE set of tools, and I won't even get into that mess. The day of release was set for 9 PM on Friday, our historically lowest traffic period. Some things we didn't know. 1. The senior and only network administrator forgot he was needed that weekend and went out camping. 2. Marketing never informed us that Friday they did a huge campaign push that would double our traffic because... 3. That weekend was the first weekend of a huge trade show with our customer base as the primary focus where... 4. They advertised our service in a live presentation in front of thousands as well as demos in the trade booth. 5. There were a dozen new features and services that I was not informed of, including connections to other services. And 6. The outsourcing team had figured out a way to falsify results in testing by fooling our metric measures for the health of applications, New Relic among others, into reporting things were okay. I made the change to production. At first, it seemed pretty good. I was mildly surprised that the entire website interface had changed because up until this point, I was only looking at the back end. But one of the banners to our partner did not load. I traced why and realized that ICE prevented XSS weak applications and the IP wasn't in the approved connections list. I tried to get hold of the network admin but got no response. He wasn't online either. Oh well, that's only one blink banner among... Wait, now the entire site won't load. Oh, there it is. No, it's not. Other developers were reporting intermittent outages. Long story short, Docker's networking bridge was not playing nice with our load balancer. I tried repeatedly to get in touch with the networking admin, but again, he wasn't answering his cell or pages. The CTO started talking about rolling back. The brain just laughed it all off, calling it the price for pedal to the metal. We started a conference call. But by 11 p.m., it was obvious that the site was barely working. Finally, the brain relented to rolling back, which I was already prepared for, or so I thought. Apparently, one of the changes was how the Docker application wrote to the database, and the changed database was not backwards compatible. Thus, now the old site was freaked. We called in one of our DBAs who, after an hour or so of trying various things, said that we would have to restore from a backup database and rebuild everything from various incremental dumps made throughout the week. This did not include any of the changes marketing made for the trade show, which was apparently a massive push earlier that morning. The person who made the changes was not reachable. It turned out she was on the trade show floor, unreachable because the convention center blocked cell signal to prevent tethering, and so she turned off her phone. And when we finally did get hold of her on Saturday afternoon, she said all the changes were back at the office and not with her. The company had to pay for emergency tickets to fly her back to the office to re-push the changes. And due to a weather situation, her flights were delayed, and she didn't get back to the office until Sunday afternoon. By Sunday evening, we had our site up and working as it was Friday afternoon, which was fine with everybody. That Monday, the board of directors who were present for the trade show had an emergency post-apocalypse meeting over video conference, and they were ticked as ticked can be. Apparently, 9 p.m. was during the on-stage presentation, so the app failed in the middle of the demo in front of thousands. Luckily, marketing had run into this before because of network problems, so they had a simulated demo they switched to, but it was awkward for a few minutes. Plus, the trade show booth didn't have anything to show anyone until Monday. The brain doubled down on his insistence that he did the right thing and threw everyone else under the bus in front of his board friends. I was blamed, the CTO was blamed, the networking admin was blamed, and even the DBA was blamed. The coders were sort of blamed. After explanations were made in various ways, the vice chairman summarized the situation fairly accurately in what seemed like a rehearsed speech about how crappy our communications and teamwork were. And he said HR would be contacted about our continued employment as we were all put on suspension. That term was never clarified. Within a week, the brain was gone. I am not sure if he was fired or quit, but suddenly the CDO, who was out that week due to a family situation, said the following Monday that this project was now being run by one of the other project managers, actually one of the better ones, and that we should consider business as usual moving forward. There were countless meetings afterwards discussing the disaster, many which devolved into shouting matches, and eventually I quit because the stress was way too much. I ought to do some freelance work for a while. The company was bought out a few years later. Everyone was let go. The project was merged with theirs until the branding was all changed. Then that company was bought out. I'm not sure who owns it now. The old website resolves to the second buyer's main website, and frankly, I don't care to do any deep research to that niche industry. I did find the brain on LinkedIn. He ended up being some technical director of one of those Herbalife clones, and the trail ends in 2017. I heard from a friend of a friend that the brain went on some religious sabbatical in the mountains of India at some point, which seems like him. Hope he found himself because I don't want to go looking for him. Just terrible management, skipping like every basic rule of development, forcing new and untried and true technology on people. It was a disaster in the making. It doesn't surprise me that the road it went down was a bumpy one. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to and watching the Storytime channel. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing and leave any feedback you can in the comments below. Thank you again for watching and listening to the Storytime channel.